My name is James Cameron. Can it be that this is one more story of Venice? Doesn't everyone know that Venice is beautiful? Do we know that Venice is dying? I must see Venice while Venice is still there.
Presumably, if anywhere is Venice, this is Venice. This enormous, sumptuous, voluptuous explosion of piety and the Byzantine taste. One of the great places of Europe dedicated to the glory of Christendom and of Thomas Cook. To the 27,800,000 photographs that have been taken of St. Mark's, let's add a few more. What the basilica actually had to do with St. Mark, nobody seems to know. It seems the Venetians borrowed him, or stole him more likely, from Egypt to give luster to their empire. But the nice, skeptical Venetians were never all that pious anyhow. They listened to the Vatican when it suited them, but they insisted on electing their own priests, and they told the Pope about it afterwards. And then if the priests got troublesome or uppish, they put them in cages and they hung them high up on the bell tower there. They could stay there a year or more if their friends passed them up a bite of food from time to time. It was said to have been one of the great tourist attractions of the time.
Even without the priests, the tourists came. Venice is a very difficult place not to make documentaries about. Everyone has done it. Everyone's been here. Shelley wrote poems here. Ruskin bought a house here. Byron swam the Grand Canal here. Browning made love here. Hemingway got drunk here. Everyone took away a bit of Venice in his heart, except me. And now there's not much time. Let's take a stroll down Main Street.
It really is a bit much for a city to have a main street like this. A Grand Canal that's not only absurdly beautiful, but commercially central too. One isn't used to things that are at the same time useful and lovely. It'll go, of course, as all Venice will go, as we'll go, under the imperatives of nature and progress. But in the meantime, the Grand Canal isn't an archaism, it isn't a relic for the tourist, it's a practical street. Everything that Venice means began here. 46 little side canals join it, like byroads anywhere. And 200 great palaces line its banks up to their ankles in water, dreaming of past glories and future grants. 3 bridges only span the Grand Canal, of which, of course, the most resoundingly illustrious is that fabulous arc of Shakespeare's memory, the Rialto, the great stock exchange of the 15th century, where Shylock checked his loans and 8 generations of Venetians watched the stock market. What's new on the Rialto? Nothing. Nothing.
These strange, familiar byways are still the only thoroughfares of Venice, meandering, awkward, tranquil, with a consoling inconvenience. There's a civility about the traffic problems among these liquid lanes and watery walls, behind which people take to higher and higher floors. It was a great place once, one of the world's greatest, a city of rich grandeur and renown. Think of that past of opulence and luxury, those doges and patricians, the sumptuous delights, the 11,000 courtesans and 20,000 spies. It is incredibly true that this whole ancient city was built on a foundation of old bits of wood, millions of timber stakes driven into a swamp of mud. Therefore, it's sinking. Lower and lower it goes each year. Higher and higher the water rises, lapping gently and hungrily up the hemline of the city it will one day have forever.
Among other things, Venice invented the ghetto. This intensely civilized and cultivated state was the first one to hit on the notion of physically isolating a society of people that it simultaneously despised and needed. In this, as in so many other things, Venice led the world. The Jews came to Venice in the 1370s as refugees, naturally, and by, a century later, the Doges invented for them the world's very first ghetto, which may not be much of a distinction, but is at least characteristically original. In this ghetto, the Jews had to wear conspicuous red hats, and they were extortionately taxed for the privilege of being locked in at sunset, and indeed they had to pay the wages of the Christian guards who kept them there. But naturally, in the perverse Venetian way, they were also protected with curious privileges. The Venetian Jews were, after all, the great financiers of their time, and they turned Venice into the sort of Zurich of the period. There are fewer than 1,000 Jews left in Venice now.
The other thing that Venice invented uniquely for its own purposes was, of course, the gondola, gliding about these shallow canals unchanged for 900 years. Unchanged not because it's pretty, which it is, but because its design is wholly and completely functional. The gondola is unchanged because it is precisely right, with its exactly 280 pieces of wood of 7 different timbers, exactly 33 feet long and 4.5 feet wide, with its queer lopsided keel 2/3 across the middle to counteract the dynamic of the oar. Every immutable detail as it was in the beginning and is now at a cost of £700. Maybe it is a challenge that they still make gondolas. The fact is, it's the only practical way to get about. It costs a couple of pennies to get across. When winter comes and the tourists go home, the population of Venice drops by 3/4. Then Venice becomes again a small town with a small time's life and preoccupation, with all the vast historic mercantile traditions of the Venetian Empire reduced and concentrated into the housewives buying and selling in the marketplace. This was the city that traded in the world's fortunes. This was the city that provisioned the Crusades. Now, in the shadow of the Rialto Bridge itself, Venice bargains over a kilo of scampi from the lagoon. What a wonderfully wholesome thing it is to have a city of pedestrians. No streets, and therefore no cars, thank God, no cars. Venetians either walk or boat. Life is conditioned to this tangled maze of alleys and quays and bridges, 500 bridges, more to the square mile than anywhere else on earth. Venice is something almost biological, with the canals as the blood vessels, the squares as the lungs, and the rise and fall of the tides as the pulse of the heart. It seems that, like all organic things, Venice is mortal. Now the year dies away in the grey tones of winter. Venice is now an aging hostess to an aging people, and their numbers diminish all the time. Their children go away to the mainland, where there's work and cars and modern plumbing. Each year, 1 in every 3 Venetians decides that there is little reason to stay. They don't want to live on tourist handouts half the year and phantoms for the rest, waiting for the end of the line, the journey across the lagoon to the island cemetery of San Michele. A community without a square centimetre of soil to spare must bury its dead above ground in a formal gallery of sepulchral marble filing cabinets. The children, taking up less room, have the brief benefit of a grave, but it's a temporary tenancy. Like every old society rooted in history, deeply in love with death, Venice has always had an affectionate nostalgia for the tomb. These cold stone cupboards of mortality in San Michele may well be the last things of Venice to go. What an incredible place it was, this unprecedented and uncopied principality, this bizarre aristocratic republic of exquisitely tasteful cruelty and loveliness that for 1,000 years was unique in all the world. Venice was the greatest maritime empire on earth, the greatest naval power. It was an exotic enclave of imagination built out of the sea itself, created on these mudflats, poised between Christ and Islam, between the Adriatic and the Orient, reaching out from this faded lagoon to the jewels and spices of the East. Venice at its prime was something no one had ever known, something marvelously stern and splendid. But even Venice had a fabulous ancestor. Among the mudflats lies the dim and dismal island of Torcello, and this is the place to which the founding fathers first came and built their civilization, until a plague destroyed it. And they transplanted their whole city-state over the water, stone by stone and beam by beam, and rebuilt it where Venice is today. If there is a ghost of Venice, Torcello is that ghost, a visible reminder of what Venice could itself become. Side by side stand the old Gothic and Byzantine churches, east and west, and equally desolate today. All that keeps Venice from destruction by the storm are the old sea walls, the murazzi, the last great engineering work of the lost republic in its dying days. 6,000 yards of Istrian granite laid to keep the Adriatic at bay from the lagoon. The Austrians reinforced them 100 years ago. Nobody bothered about them much since. And in 1966, not surprisingly, the Adriatic came raging in. Every year, the tides grow higher around St. Mark's. Below the bell tower, the land has sunk 7 inches in the last 50 years. Even the obese and arrogant pigeons, those indulged pensioners of Venice, are deprived of their foothold, I'm glad to say. They can at least take to the air angrily and impatiently. The Venetians can't. At high water, the wintry Venetians must trudge and trip their way to work across their little catwalks above the flood. They've long since got used to this. They are vaguely aware that the old wooden foundations beneath their feet are rotting and subsiding, and they can see for themselves that their old canals that were intended only for the gentle gondola are now churned up by the power boats and vaporetti that send waves against the buildings that their fabric was never meant to endure. They know, too, that the new towns and factories on the mainland, with their growing demands, are draining the supporting water table of the whole country. In consequence, the Venetians must live more and more like amphibians. It looks amusing enough, but what a bore it must be, year after year, this tedious splashing about, worse every winter. How demoralizing.